Hey there, Eli here, and today we're going to be going over a use case scenario where I take this build as it stands at level 89 and turn it into, or get much closer to, this monstrosity. To properly set your expectations, we're going to be spending all of our time in this video in Path of Building and on the trade site, because I think it'll be useful to go through how I read Path of Building from my current character to the goal of where I want it to be, and then how I go about incrementally upgrading and how I search for things on the trade site in order to give you kind of the nuts and bolts of how we go from white tier maps, yellow tier maps to tier 16 reds that are alchemied and veiled, for 110, 120% quantity bonuses, juiced maps. There is a process, and it is pretty similar no matter what build you're using. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this video is intended to be kind of a teach a man to fish scenario, and hopefully you find it useful. Let's get started. So what I like to do when I start building towards a specific kind of build and I have a guide for it, I first look at the item list and I kind of go through to get a kind of general idea of where the build creator is coming from for the type of gear that they want. So in this one, the first thing that jumps out to me is the Headhunter, of course. Headhunter by itself doesn't really add any damage. It does add a lot of survivability, utility, and eventually it does add a lot of damage for this build because you are gaining attack speed by stealing the souls of rare mobs. This isn't really relevant though, so I'm kind of going to ignore the Headhunter because it's a Headhunter, and they cost typically like 70 exalts in a league, and that's completely unrealistic to buy. So let's look at the things that are realistic and kind of suss out why they're doing what they're doing. So first off is the bow. Because it's Toxic Rain, this is kind of a typical weapon that you would expect to see. It's a +3, so he's definitely using Empower in his links, which is of course expensive. I mean, if you just glance at this build, it's super expensive. Look at the items on it. That's fine. Just because you can have super expensive items in a build doesn't mean you have to in order for it to function. So this is a pretty standard bow. We'd expect to see that. Maloney's mechanism. So this is an interesting one. So if we read this, it has 3 sockets total, and it triggers a socketed bow skill when you attack with a bow. It also blinds. So the next thing I do is I say, okay, why does he want 3 sockets in his quiver? Let's go to his skills. And here we go. We can find this in weapon slot 2, which is our quiver. He wants to have Toxic Rain with a Mirage Archer, always on, that is attacking with Withering Touch. This makes sense. So as you're just attacking, he's going to have a Mirage Archer that is just automatically applying Withered stacks, which helps us apply a little bit of extra damage. So the quiver is a maybe to me. We'll see. And then we go to the helm. We totally expect to see a -9 Chaos Resist helm. The Toxic Rain enchant and the +1 of AoE gems, these are nice to haves. And also the Chaos Resist is a nice to have. The primary factor here that we want is -9 Chaos Resist. That's not too hard to get by itself. Carcass Jack, of course, makes perfect sense. We want the AoE, we want the damage. Asenath's Gentle Touch. This is, of course, more of a chase unique. They're more like 8 exalts roughly in a league. They're very strong because they have the Corpse Explosion. We don't really need these. This is more endgame ideas, but it is certainly something we can build up towards. At Ziri's Step, clearly the main source of defensive layer is going to be our dodge chance, because we can glance down here and say, oh, we have capped dodge chance. He probably has Veil Grace activated on his tree already. Let's go over to take a look at skills, and we'll find Veil Grace, and we'll take that off. And okay, without Veil Grace, probably assuming he's been hit, he probably has, the Pantheon with Soul of Lunaris. So he has a bunch of things layered so that he has maximum spell dodge, which is really important, and almost maximum getting near with attack dodge. So that's our main defensive layer. So the Ziri's Step with the extra chance to dodge spells when you've been hit, this makes perfect sense. That's not terribly expensive. The Amulet, obviously this is an expensive amulet. The +1 all gems really isn't something that you must have here, so I'm not too worried about that. It's more about getting, looks like, resistances and having that chaos damage over time multiplier. So that's not too bad, that's pretty doable. For our rings, we have increased effect on our malevolence, obviously a nice to have. Not going to make or break the build. Loath Eye, this one stands out as kind of a critical item because you're auto-applying Despair on hit. You don't want to be wasting your time when you're trying to stack pods to deal damage to apply a curse. So this seems like a pretty critical one that we want to keep our eye on. Headhunter, and then we have our flasks. So the blue flasks at the start, I don't really pay too much attention to them. Those are things you can buy or usually roll yourself. Not a big deal. The Dying Sun, what's interesting that I like to do with the unique flasks is I like to hover over them because you see there at the bottom, it shows us 28.6% DPS. That's why he has Dying Sun. So it tells me extra projectiles are really important and increased AoE is also pretty important. But mostly the extra projectiles is going to help us build damage and DPS on this build. So Dying Sun, something we want. That's a huge damage boost. 28% is humongous. And it looks like Forbidden Taste he has for phasing and for extra dodge and for recovering life because he has maximum chaos resist. So the flasks are pretty malleable. And then we have just a bunch of cluster jewels. We'll get to that in a little bit because right now we're mostly focused on just the main gear. First on the list is understanding how our build deals damage. Toxic Rain deals damage by stacking pods on top of themselves in a small area. This is critical in understanding how to read the damage output that we get from Path of Building. In this particular video, we're not going to spend any time in the calcs page looking at our effective hit points, but I do want to take a moment and point out that this is an extremely important section of your build. What this will tell you is how effective your layers of defense are, but because this build is an evasion and dodge chance build, it's just not very interesting. We simply rely on evading and dodging attacks that actually manage to connect with us visually on screen, and hope that the dice roll lands in our favor. With that in mind, throughout this video, I'm not going to touch on the configuration page while I'm talking about the build, but understand that I do have maximum number of overlapping pods, so that we get our total DPS on one target. And we're going to say 10 Withered stacks because it's relatively easy for this build to do that with Withering Step. When it becomes relevant, I will have turned on power charges, frenzy charges, and endurance charges. If you're curious about the configuration tab here or the calcs window, I do have 2 videos on Path of Building, and I recommend you go check them out. So now let's take a look at where I was at level 89 with my build. As you can see, I'm missing quite a few items. So what was I doing? If we go over to our skills list, we can see, okay, I have Mirage Archer attached to my main damaging Toxic Rain, as you can see from all these support gems. I had Tornado Shot that was applying my Despair with Pierce, so I was just throwing out Tornado Shots every now and again to apply Despair and then throwing out Toxic Rain. And then I had my buffs that you would expect to have in Withering Step, and I had a Wither Totem. Remember that thing about not wanting to like stop and apply Despair and stop and apply Wither? That's exactly what I was doing, but I had no other choice at this point in the build, right? I had limited resources in terms of cash, and I was still building up my levels in order to get passive slots on the tree. So what are the things that I pointed out from that original gear list? We talked about the ring that applies Despair on hit. We talked about the Dying Sun. So what I did is I added Dying Sun to my build list, even though I don't have it yet. And I said, okay, the Silver Flask is probably my least useful flask at this point in time. At least that's what the decision that I made. And so I decided to bring it in and say, what happens if I bring in a Dying Sun? Oh, that's pretty important. 40% more damage. So I farmed and I got some cash and I went and picked up a Dying Sun because that is critical. So then what else did I do? I said I need a Despair Ring so I can just auto cast my curse whenever I'm hitting something. That is a huge quality of life and damage boost because the ring gives increased effect of your curses. So let's hop over to trade and go take a look at some rings. What do? We say, okay, for this, we want to have curse enemies with Despair on hit. Maybe we want to have some life, and maybe we need intelligence. We're not sure because, and here, just without specifying anything, we can see. That was cool. Got a follower during a video. That's never happened before. Okay, as we can see, without anything filtered on here, kind of a garbage ring. If we can't afford anything, however, this is probably worthwhile. Because keep in mind, not only are we applying our curses instantly to anything that we're fighting, it also has increased effect, and Despair is very powerful for our build. But you know, we want a ring that we're going to want to use for a little while, so let's go back to our filters, and let's say like 30 life. Okay, now we're getting into like 4, 9, 10, 15 chaos range, right? So now we can kind of scroll through 33 intelligence. We've got some resistance rings here. We've got more life rings. This is where you can pick and choose and say, is there anything that I need to fix? Do I need to fix my attributes? Do I need to fix some resistances right now? This is where you can say, okay, I can spend maybe 10 chaos. I could get this 4 chaos ring, or I could spend a little bit more and get a decent amount of intelligence and get a little cold resist, as well as the 32% increased effect, which is the tier 1, which is certainly what we want. Now, moving on. So we have our ring. Let's go back. And we're just going to shift over here into my current version 2. This is after I ended up getting this ring right here, which, as you can see, life, despair on hit, a little bit of resist. That's all this ring does for this build. So the thing about getting this despair ring is if we go back to our first version, this is the ring that I replace. Notice that I have intelligence on this, and this build is struggling with intelligence. So what do I have to do? I said, well, my gloves are really not doing a whole lot for me. They're providing resistances, a little bit of damage. This is a generic item. I can totally replace this with intelligence gloves, and so that's exactly what I did. We went out and searched for these, just a few chaos in order to get this. I enchanted, I happened to have the socketed AoE gems for a divine orb, and happened to have one, so I slapped my auras in there, but we replaced it with this ring with our 32% increased effect, and we lost our attributes, so we had to fix that elsewhere and just pick and choose an item that isn't really that great and is cheap enough to replace. Mostly belts, boots, gloves, at any point in the league are usually cheap to replace because everybody finds them and everybody lists them. They're an excellent source for cheap and effective resist or attribute fixing. Now, my damage didn't entirely come just from getting a Dying Sun and from getting that ring. I also decided to make a switch on my skills. I said a 5-link Quill Rain is going to be pretty cheap, so I went out and bought one. And because Toxic Rain attacks so fast, I decided to switch out my Mirage Archer into its own gem link. So this is our current 2 right here, our updated version. So as you can see, I added faster attacks through a concentrated effect. And for our secondary, I have a Toxic Rain with Mirage Archer that's also dealing damage itself. At this point in the build, I really just wanted to pump up my damage numbers, even though concentrated effect kind of sucks for this build. Then, as you can see, for utility, we were missing our Veil skill, so I picked up a Veil Haste, a Veil Grace, which is going to help my defense and offense quite a bit, and a Veil Blight, just for fun. It was kind of cool. I'm not using it now, but I might pick it back up. So at this point, I've made a lot of changes and upgrades to my items and my skills that have cost me a little bit of money. I'm doing a lot better damage-wise. We went from about 800,000 to 1.2 million. So now it's time to go back and look at our endgame build and see what our next steps are. So what I do is I go back to the tree and I start here and see what am I missing that this person has that I don't. So one thing that jumps out at me is the Thread of Hope. So it's pretty easy to go in and see, okay, why do they have this? This obviously is useful, but then we go over to Overcharged. This is clearly very powerful as we get charges while we're mapping. This is a mapping build, that is the intent. And so if we get Endurance charges and Frenzy charges, we can use Immortal Call and we get a lot more damage and attack speed. Okay, that makes sense. And then we have our skill effect duration. If we hover over them, 3.1%, 3.1%, 7.8%. That's a lot of damage for a couple of useful skill points. We do need resistances. We do want to fix those, so that's great. And then we have to deal with the fact that we have minus percentage of elemental resistance on the jewel. But it looks like at first glance this is totally worth it. So I've got my eyes on that right now. Then we zoom out, and obviously the other thing that jumps out at you is these cluster jewels. So then it's time to go and look. We've got broadside tempered arrowheads on 2 jewel socket, 8 passive skill jewels. So let's go take a look at those, shall we? Let's refresh this. And so we'll go adds number passive skills. It's an enchant on jewels. And we'll say maximum 8. And we'll say our jewel sockets. And we'll say minimum of 2. And we want tempered, and we want broadside. We didn't make this an enchant, so that's not going to search anything. So then we find, okay, these are 199, 200 chaos. That's a little bit out of our price range. So let's go back. And he also has these medium cluster jewels. So Student of Decay and Brood for Potency, Wicked Paul. So we can come back here and we'll search on those. Okay, this is a little more manageable. So 100 Chaos, 95 Chaos, we kind of expect this because this is a pretty meta build and a pretty strong build. So the jewels are going to be kind of expensive. But the point that we're looking at here is we want to see, okay, this is 2.7%. We get flask charges as well, and we get increased recovery from our flasks. That's useful. A little utility, a little damage. And we have a pure damage node in Wicked Paul. We can see total damage over time DPS is 11.3%. So that's a pretty big damage boost between the two and this little node. 1.4, 11.3, so 12.7, and then 15.4, 15% more damage, and we get a jewel slot, which helps us further fix. So this is the jewel that maybe I would go for, and also our Thread of Hope. So let's go take a look at our Thread of Hope. And what's our wording on that? It says only affects passives. Affects passives in a number ring, and we are very large. Okay, so then here it's kind of up to you. The lower you get on the elemental resist negative, the more expensive we're going to get here. So if we want to get a -10, it's 130 chaos. That's a fair bit of change. So this is where you have to play with how much money you can earn and how much you can get, and weigh the cost of whether you can deal with the negative elemental resistances at the time to remain resistance capped in order to get these nodes, which are nice utility and power and straight up damage. These are pretty significant. So this would be my goal at this point in time on my tree. So let's hop back to our tree as it is. We're going to bounce over to the next progression, which is where I did decide to get a Thread of Hope, and I went with our Eternal Suffering and Wicked Paul, which is one of the other jewels in the build. If we come back here, we can backtrack here and say, what did we get? We got Eternal Suffering and Wicked Paul, so we'll replace this with the Eternal Suffering. Turns out that's only 60 chaos, maybe a little bit cheaper if you have a little patience and wait for someone to pop up one with 55, 50 chaos. And so we decided to pick that one up and slap it into our tree. And as you can see here, if you hover over the node that is connected to the rest of the nodes, you can see our total dot DPS for this section is 19.8%. So that's pretty solid. That's pretty good. And then we came up here and we got our Thread of Hope. Thread of Hope doesn't work exactly the same way. You actually have to hover over these, but these are the same numbers that we would expect and why we have jumped up about 200,000 DPS. And in the meantime, I also found that my amulet was a little bit lacking, and so it looks like I picked up a very similar item that allowed me to put in my craft resist of lightning resist and chaos resist, which I want, and I decided to allocate corruption, which is a powerful notable for this build. If we look up here, this is our corruption node, increased effect of withered, and we get some extra damage. So that was also contributing to our bonus damage here. And if we look at this amulet, just on the base stats, the low int, decent life, and some all resist, this was not an expensive amulet. But with the crafting bench, and with allocating a node that actually makes sense for our build, we get a lot more out of this amulet, and we can rely on it for the foreseeable future because it's giving us a lot of strength and int. So from here to our next jump, we went up about 300,000 DPS. So let's take a look at how we did that. Here's where we are now. And on our tree, not much has changed, except we've taken out these nodes here, the Avatar of the Hunt cluster right here, and we've decided to take Supreme Ego. As we can see, Supreme Ego gives us 20%, and if we take out all of these nodes, all 4 nodes, we get minus 9.5%. So that gives us 3 more passive points and 10% more DPS. So Supreme Ego is the obvious choice. And with some of our free points, we also pick up an extra frenzy charge because we are now using that thanks to the overcharged notable up here. But these things by themselves don't give us 300,000 more DPS. So let's go take a look at our skills. We don't need to go through them step by step to see that we haven't really changed a whole lot here. The biggest changes that we made from our current situation here is we had our low level faster attacks and swift affliction. Looks like we reset them. We got them to level 20, reset to 120s, and looks like they're leveling back up. And we swapped into increased area of effect because that is more effective for our build to overlap the pods easier to make sure we get to our maximum DPS faster. So let's go take a look at the items. Let's go here, and here are our current items here, so we can swap back and forth. We changed 3 items, it looks like, and let's take a look at what those items are. So we have a random quiver that is giving us attack speed and life and resist. That's an easy target to fix. And we have our helm. Remember in our big bad build, we had the minus 9% chaos resistance to nearby enemies helm. That is our next target. So in current 4, up here, this is where we are now in our bumped up damage, we have gone and looked for this helm. So what did we do? We went out here. Let's reset this. And nearby enemies have number percent to chaos resistance. So let's say -9, and just putting in that gives us an idea here. We can say, well, we kind of do want some life on it, so let's make sure we have ones that have life. Okay, this isn't bad. We can work with this because right now we're just looking for a helm that has this stat because it's useful to us. Because if we go look at it, we can see that we have 9% increased damage from this helm alone. And as you can see, there's no damage on it that helps us except for that one modifier. So this helm by itself, with just that 9% chaos resist mod, is 9% more damage. So we go here, and 50 chaos, not too hard to get. We can go farm that with the chaos recipe. If we need to do that, we can find a whole slew of other ways. We'll figure that out in a different video. In the meantime, we'll pick up that helm, and we'll gain 9%. On the next round here, we have another quiver. So what did we do here? We went and we looked at our big bad build here, and we looked. He had Maloney's mechanism. I don't want to use that right now, and I can't afford it. So what's the next best thing? We want damage over time multiplier for chaos. So that's what we did. We went out and we said, hey, let's go here and find damage over time multiplier. Chaos damage over time multiplier. Let's make sure that that is a quiver, shall we? And let's say we want some life on it. And this gives us 1200 results. We can narrow it down a little bit, right? So let's say 18%. That's 931. Okay. Let's say like 50 life maybe we want on it. This is pretty good. 10 chaos. That's not bad because the 18% chaos multiplier is going to give us what? Total dot DPS 13.4%. If we take a look at this, the only mod on there that's actually helping our dot damage is that multiplier. So 13.4% for a quiver. So between these two items, we're going to gain 22% more damage. That's huge. That's huge. And what's it going to cost us? What's this quiver? 10 chaos, and the helm is like 50. So for 60 chaos, you can deal 22% more damage. That is an easy yes. That is our next goal. That's what we did here. And on a side note, it looks like we had this belt, which was just giving us some life and some cold resist. So we swapped it into this belt that gives us strength, life, and triple resist because we had a free suffix slot on it, so we could craft onto it fire resist. And the more astute viewers out there might have noticed that our DPS on current 4 says 638,000. This is because we were on the wrong Toxic Rain. We were on the Mirage Archer version. If we go here, it's actually 1.7 million. This is 300,000 roughly above our last step of current 3. So this is my 5th iteration of the build. As you can see, our DPS has gone up from 1.7 million to 2.3. And as we can see on the tree, we've decided to expand this lower section right here with one of our bigger cluster jewels. And if you remember back, that jewel for the tempered arrowheads and broadside was about 200 chaos, so I went out and I farmed that and bought this jewel and decided to pick up another one of my dual chaos jewels that they need for the mediums. Now I'll break down the sentence a little bit here. We got these 2 cluster jewels, Eternal Suffering and Wicked Paul we already had. We went out and bought a 100 chaos one, which was the Student of Decay and Wicked Paul. which is what we want. We also have our extra chaos resistance. As you can see down here, we have -2. That's pretty good. And where do we get these points? We went back and we harvested some of these other DPS nodes that we had, and a couple of, if we notice, our resistance nodes up here on current 4. But we also came back with our iteration current 5 and got some extra life. But we swapped around our nodes on the tree in order to make sure that we could get and use our new cluster jewels, which are a pretty big damage boost. Tempered arrowheads by itself is total dot DPS of 13.4%. And then we also have this new jewel. We have Student of Decay, which is, actually we can just look at this guy right here. We have this jewel, which is giving us another 20%. So between the cluster jewel, the big one, with tempered arrowheads, and this new smaller jewel, we are getting about 33% more damage from those. It cost us like 300 chaos to do it, but that is where you get into, at least for a meta build, and specifically Toxic Rain here, these jewels are expensive. They just are. So now let's go take a look at the skills. Here's where we are now on iteration 4 or current 4. And if we swap over to 5, we can see we've gained a couple levels on some support gems, but nothing's really changed between our setup here. So we'll go over to our items. As you can see here, we have our current iteration number 4, and we swap over to our now 5th iteration, and nothing's changed. We just have our new jewels. So between the last iteration and this one, we decided to go out and farm enough currency to get our cluster jewels. Now, on the final iteration for this video, we have current iteration number 5. If we hop over to current iteration 6, you can see we've expanded this section of the tree with another cluster jewel and some more medium-sized jewels. At this point in the build, we're simply filling out and fulfilling the other cluster jewels that we need, that we saw from our original big bad build, that we know were going to cost a lot of money, and so we went out and farmed it and we applied it to our build. As you can see, it's assisted us in getting some damage. If we go to our skills on both, nothing really has changed here, okay? And if we go over to our items, we've decided to pick up in, so here's current iteration 5, which is where we just were, and then hop over to 6, and we'll see we have a new belt, we have new ring, new amulet, and new armor, as well as our new cluster jewels. So the point of this is that we are continuously cycling through and saying, okay, where do we want to be? And what items individually are going to give us the most bang for our buck, right? At first, we worked on our base armor set. We didn't look at cluster jewels because cluster jewels are typically going to be expensive, but look it up for your build and find out if it actually is, and then place them into Path of Building to get a sense. You know, you can hover over them kind of like we did, and you can see that's 8.6% damage right by itself. And then we have this one, another 4% it looks like, with some extra chaos resist, and a jewel socket. So we can, and jewel sockets can do basically anything. So if you need resists, attributes, more damage, a jewel can do it. So there is intrinsic value there for your build in order to progress and fill the slots that you need in order to make sure that you stay resist capped and you make sure that you have your life pool high enough that you can take a couple hits so that you can react. If you're getting one-shotted by everything, it's time to take a look at our life pool, take a look at our layers of defense. Do we have high evasion, high armor? Do we have dodge? What do we have that is allowing us? Do we have block? What is it that's stopping us from dying or giving us a breather so that we can hit our life flask, hit our movement skill, whatever it is? I can say that at level 92 with this particular build, for anyone who cares, I've had a lot of fun going on 93. This thing kicks a lot of ass. As you can see, I've made a lot of currency with it, bought some pretty ridiculous items, but that all said, were they actually necessary? Not totally, but there's a lot of content that I want to push that's kind of beyond the realm of tier 16. And this process by which we've just talked about has allowed me to do that, taking incremental steps, upgrading specific items one at a time to what I need them to be in order to fix my resists, fix my attributes, and fix my damage. I really hope that this video helped give you a sense of how we go about doing that, because every time I see on the Reddit or my friends struggling to figure out why it is they're dying at tier 10s or tier 12s or 16s or whatever it is, I wish I could impart this knowledge, so that's what I've tried to do here. This is build agnostic advice. It works with anything. Doesn't matter what you're doing. This process will help you achieve whatever goal it is you have for your particular build. Before we sign off, I'm going to pet my wolf here. What a good boy. And as always, if you like this video, if you found it helpful, subscribe, give it a like, give it a comment. That really helps me know that what I'm doing is useful for the community and to keep going this direction. Until I see you again, stay sane, exiles.